What was the lost technology? Technology can take a million forms, but technology requires a good understanding of nature. In other words, it requires science. If this ancient high technology were the result of alien presence, it would be the result of the work of a high-tech civilization. But that civilization would be on another planet, and so would all of the science behind their technology. We would only have records of sightings from a distance. We wouldn't have records of the science. But if traces of science do exist from the ancient world, it means that the experiments were done here. It means it's not aliens. So think for a moment about what it would take to convince you ancient people knew advanced science so long ago, and after such a great cataclysm, that no artifacts remain, only legends and symbols. I found enough information in ancient myths about things matching the description of aircraft, including details that ancient people shouldn't have known, for me to take the topic seriously. And I realized that if I wanted to argue the existence of ancient aircraft without actually any pictures of ancient aircraft existing, the best way to do it, since the ancient descriptions seem to be of powered aircraft, making loud noises and emitting fire, etc., would be to find the engine. If I could find evidence of an ancient aircraft engine, that would make the case for ancient aircraft a lot more plausible, because the engine was the limitation in the modern day of people actually getting off the ground. The Wright brothers were struggling to build an aircraft that could carry a man aloft, including the 200-pound engine, and do it with only 12 horsepower. So that was the major limitation. If there was some sort of ancient aircraft engine, there must have been aircraft. Somebody would have put it on a boat. The boat would have gone faster and faster, would have leapt into the air, they would have put fins on it, eventually would have turned into an airplane. So I started looking into the various kinds of engines that matched the ancient testimony, the particular sights and sounds, the thunderous noises, the flickering flames. And I wanted it to be a very simple engine, because we don't find any evidence of more complicated mechanical engines like we use today, which have very particular shaped parts we don't find in any ancient symbols. And it needed to be a different technology, a technology we wouldn't necessarily recognize. The problem is that if I'm looking for evidence of an ancient aircraft engine, the ancient accounts say that these were flying, hundreds of miles an hour. They had tens of thousands of horsepower. It was a highly developed technology. And as technology develops, it starts at a certain point, but it rapidly changes form as the practicalities and the natural evolution happens. Like, there isn't much of a resemblance between the original Carl Benz engine powering his first quadricycle and a modern Mercedes-Benz race car engine. If you look at them from the outside, they don't look similar at all. If you could see the component parts inside, you would see they have some things in common. But from the outside, you can't tell. And if I wanted to find an ancient engine that is based on a different technology than we use today, an undeveloped technology, what would it look like? How would I know what to look for? What would be its final form? And so trying to conceptually refine a undeveloped engine is probably impossible, but I just decided to give it my best shot. And doing that required learning about such things as thermodynamics, detonation waves, and gas flows in general. And so I went to the UCLA Science and Engineering Library. Now, at this point, I was already familiar with ancient symbols, because I'd been interested in this topic for years and years, and I already had a theory which I'd thrown out, trying to explain the Egyptian solar boat as basically a radar dish. But it didn't lead anywhere. It was kind of a dead end. But I was very familiar with the Egyptian symbols. And so I arrived at the Science and Engineering Library, grabbed an armload of books on topics I needed to research, and started thumbing through the books, and they are really dry. It's almost unimaginable how dry these books are. I mean, literally, some chapters are just equation, and then the word therefore, and then another equation, and if we substitute this and this and this, and then another equation, it just goes on and on like that. It's very dry. I can't even figure out what they're looking at. They could sure benefit from some graphs instead of just the mathematical symbols. So I put down the real dry books, and I picked up one that seemed to be for more of a popular audience. Although it was still technical, it had more pictures in it at least. And as I was thumbing through it, I got to a section on some weather phenomenon, and I realized that it resembled an ancient Egyptian symbol that I had always been trying to explain. And I flipped through some more pages, and I found more diagrams that looked suspiciously like ancient Egyptian symbols. I didn't know it at the time, but I had found the lost science. And there's nothing sacred about it. The evidence for the science consists of similarities between ancient symbols and modern technical diagrams and photographs of experiments in a very narrow field. Now, there's no scientific way to objectively rate similarities. It's not science. So you'll have to judge for yourself how many visual coincidences are too many. It also requires, to accept my argument, you have to accept that a two-dimensional plot is a very obvious way to communicate information. I'm talking about a Cartesian plot with two axes at 90 degrees and increasing values as you get away from the axis. So if you reject the idea that that's obvious, I can't make an argument. We won't be doing numerology and trying to link numbers together and claim that ancient people, were writing a secret code. It's not going to be trying to decode information ancient people put in. It's trying to reveal ancient people had an advanced understanding of nature. And since nature hasn't changed, we can use nature as the objective outside reference. So let's start with this symbol. And this is the one that came to symbolize for me, regardless of its conventional meaning. It symbolized for me the weirdness of Egypt. It's a symbol called Sema. The Sema symbol is the central pillar in the diagram at the top left, with the crown-shaped thing at the bottom. It's a bilateral sign, meaning that it has two sounds associated with it, the S sound and the M sound, and the vowels are filled in. So by convention, it's pronounced Sema. The symbol by itself means unity or unification. When it's combined with the lotus and papyrus stems, as shown here, it becomes Sematawi, which is uniter of the two lands. So it's supposed to represent unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. But that's only one of its meanings. What it's supposed to actually represent is the lungs and windpipe of a sheep. And we believe this, the conventional scientific view comes from the fact that mummies were found in ancient Egypt with this symbol painted on the chest, and also, even though all the organs had been hollowed out from the mummies, the lungs and windpipe had been fashioned into this shape and replaced into the chest. And so when the symbol is drawn on the chest, it's supposed to represent the breath of life in the afterlife. It has other meanings, though. It's also the axle of the divine potter's wheel of the god Khnum, the divine potter. He's originally a god of the Nile, and later the god of clay, because the Nile deposits silt and deposits clay. So a sheep's lungs and windpipe stand for unification, and also the axle of a potter's wheel. But that's not all. It's also the form of a vase used in the Jubilee foot washing ritual, where the pharaoh's feet would be washed in the Jubilee ceremony celebrating 25 years of reign. An example of one of those vases is shown at the lower left. King Tut's tomb contained one. But you can see that the three-dimensional version of this symbol doesn't look like a lungs and windpipe, because, there are two lungs. Each one would form a lobe at the base, and the windpipe has striations, but this is shown without striations on the windpipe, and there's no pair of lungs. There's just the apple-shaped structure at the bottom. It's rotationally symmetric. Yet, the Tawi symbol is flat. So, how do we explain that? So there are just so many inconsistencies with the conventional explanation. This windpipe is tapered. But if a real animal had a tapered windpipe, they would have a severe choking hazard. If any food got in there, it would jam. And so that's not evolutionarily plausible. The proportions are all wrong. the windpipe is much too long for the size of the lungs. If the lungs were pumping in and out, no fresh air could actually reach the lungs. It would all be in the long windpipe. Even for a giraffe, these proportions are wrong. It's supposed to be the lungs and windpipe of a sheep because Egyptologists say it matches the muscular structure of a sheep. But sheep were considered unclean. Egyptians didn't eat sheep. How can you wash feet with sheep guts? That doesn't make any sense. And how can the disembodied respiratory system of a sheep symbolize unity? That makes no sense. The foot washing vase, as I said before, is axisymmetric. It's not shaped like a pair of lungs. And how can the floppy trachea of a sheep be the axle of Khnum's potter's wheel? So now I'll show you what this really is. I was flipping through the popular audience science book and saw a cross-sectional diagram of a natural phenomenon, including a particular part of the structure at the base that we normally don't think about. Everybody's familiar with this phenomenon. But this phenomenon actually does unite heaven and earth, or upper with lower, and has a river in the middle. It could be used to wash the feet of these gods here. It is axisymmetric, and it has an axis of rotation extending into the sky. And so, being the axle of Khnum's potter's wheel is at least plausible. Moreover, it actually is a windpipe. In fact, in German, it's called a wind hose. I won't show you the diagram from the book instead, because the diagram isn't that great. Instead, I'll show you an actual photograph. Now, I'm going to fade the photograph in and look at the point where the god's feet are resting on top of the symbol. Now, I'll fade in the photograph. The natural phenomenon I saw the cross-sectional diagram of was a water spout. So this is the little sister of the tornado, and it's a tornado that occurs over water. It has a little bit different form to it. But this textbook diagram had a cross-section of the structure at the base, which is a V-shaped structure I had never noticed before. Never even thought about it before. I'd always drawn cartoon tornadoes tapering down to a point at the bottom, kind of like a stiletto heel. Never thought about what was going on at the base. But if you think about the various images that you've seen of tornadoes, you realize that the area where the pickup trucks are circling around, the pickup trucks and the roofs of the trailer park homes, is in this V-shaped structure at the base. In 3 dimensions, it's more like an apple shape. So it has a central windpipe. The way a tornado works is the air is flowing down in the middle. It's not like a dust devil. The air is flowing down in the middle, cold, dry air. There's hot, humid air down here. The cold, dry air condenses the moisture out of the hot, humid air, releasing the heat from that water into the air, causing it to get very hot and rise like a hot air balloon. That's what powers the tornado. It's hot air rising out here, cold air coming down in the middle. Cold air coming down in the middle sustains a low pressure zone around which the air circulates. The phenomenon's not really that well understood. The tornado literature mostly focuses on predicting tornadoes rather than how they actually work, the structure. The weird thing is that the SEMA symbol is a better cross-sectional diagram of a waterspout than you can find in a modern textbook. Modern textbook diagrams are tracings from photographs, and they're largely guesswork because people don't know the internal structure of the tornado well enough to really be certain. SEMA is a better drawing of a tornado or a waterspout. Laboratory tornadoes are made very much like dust devils with a central updraft. They're not really models of the tornado, which is powered by condensation of humidity. The tornado is actually more like a steam engine than a dust devil, which is more like a chimney. What do the papyrus and lily vines mean? It could be flow lines. It hasn't really been studied well enough to know. However, from the historical perspective, the oldest description of a waterspout is from 1200 AD, south of England. Studying waterspouts is very difficult. They only last a few minutes. Studying waterspouts in depth, including the cross-section, wasn't done in the modern day until well after aircraft, speedboats, and photography were in common use. The ancient Egyptians were not capable of studying this when the symbol supposedly originated. And you can see that the proportions are pretty much right, and that means that the dashed lines at the top of the symbol represent the cloud base. So if a waterspout is powered by the release of latent heat from the vapor saturated air near the ocean, and the heat release leads to a rising current of hot air from this crown structure at the base, on which the gods are stepping, could the fat bellies of these gods represent the saturated air engorged with heat and water? Another sign symbolically related to Sema is Nefer, meaning harmony or beauty. Nefer is said to represent the heart and windpipe of a sheep rather than the lungs and windpipe. It has a shorter neck and a more bulbous base with a secondary line on the bulge. I believe that Nefer is a waterspout also, but seen at an angle from above the ground. The apple-shaped structure in that case takes on a more bulbous shape, and the foreshortening of perspective shortens the neck. So, what is a waterspout fundamentally? Well, it's a vortex. It's a fundamental structure made by a fluid. While solids can take many shapes, fluids take the shape of their container and can form only two kinds of stable structures, waves and vortices. These structures are dynamic. They're created by the motion and shaped by the properties of the fluid. Waves are pressure variations that always radiate away at a fixed speed based on the properties of the fluid. Vortices are regions of rotating fluid. When fluid rotates, it's flung outward, but this force is balanced by low pressure that's generated toward the inside. So it's kind of like an orbit of planets. It's balanced. Outward force versus inward force. In order to maintain the low pressure within the vortex, since a vortex occurs along a line, an axis, the axis either has to loop around back to itself, making a ring, or it has to connect two different regions of different pressure, and then there's a flow from one region to the other. The fluid in the very core of the vortex rotates like a solid, where every bit of the fluid rotates at the same number of revolutions per minute. Outside that core, the fluid rotates slower as you move away from the core. It's undergoing continuous shear and deformation. You can visualize shear and actually experience it for yourself if you stack a bunch of sandwich bags on a table. Just to grab a whole box of Ziploc bags, tear the bags out, and place the whole stack on a table. Now press down and slide the top layer on the other layers. You'll notice that the deeper layers move proportionally less. A fluid, such as air or water, does the same thing. It's called shear, fluid shear. Although it's not in, separate layers like the bags. It's a continuous medium made of particles. The fluids stick to surfaces just like the bags seem to stick to the hand and the table, because the force that is generated from one sliding against the other is too little to break it free. There's no way to unstick it. There's a vortex core in the middle, and the size of that vortex core is dictated by the viscosity or thickness of the fluid. A thick fluid makes a small vortex core, and a thin fluid makes a large one. We're most familiar with viscosity for motor oil, but all fluids have the property of viscosity. Even air has a viscosity, has a certain thickness to it. In the outer zone, undergoing shear outside the vortex core, the ideal vortex is described as having irrotational flow. But you have to watch out, because this word implies something other than what it really means. What it means is that if you place a foreign object in this flow that's going around the center of the vortex, no rotation will be imparted to that object. That it will circle the center without spinning. The reason for this is that the apparent rotation in one direction is canceled out by the shear deformation in the other direction, and so no rotation is imparted to the foreign object. If you could draw a line of ink or smoke across the shear zone by magic, you would see that line form into a spiral, as shown in this diagram on the top left. because the fluid toward the inside of the vortex rotates progressively faster. The other spiral within a circle is an illustration of how it would look marked by a streak of, say, cloud. This illustration is from the beginning of the book on vortices. It coincidentally resembles the Egyptian hieroglyph for the U sound. It's supposed to be a coil of rope, but it's awfully short for a piece of rope. Here are a bunch of other diagrams attempting to graphically describe the behavior of a vortex, in particular the pressure variations and the fluid speed variations. Now, the plot at the upper right shows the rotational speed of the fluid moving away from the center of the vortex. So where the rotation is as a solid body, it's a straight line increasing because the rotation speed, since it's solid, increases straight. And then there's a border to the shear zone where the speed continuously decreases, but it's not a straight line. It goes asymptotically out to infinity. The vortex really has no size. It just gets weaker and weaker the further away you get, limited by how long the vortex has existed and how quickly the shear is transmitted in the fluid, or how close the next vortex is. In the center, the concentric ovals here are a representation of the shear zone, and they're kind of like sliding plastic sheets against each other with the fast bit in the center. The shape to the left and below the ovals is the same and represents the pressure distribution. It's a parabola at the bottom and a hyperbola at the top. Parabola is the natural shape of a surface of a liquid rotating as a solid body, and a hyperbola is the shape of the irrotational flow in the shear zone. The central figure is the outline of a bathtub vortex, cross-sectional view of a bathtub vortex. It's a natural hyperbola, kind of like a trumpet bell, but it has a sharp parabola at the bottom. That's the solid body rotation zone. Now, these graphs of the properties of a vortex may look familiar because they bear a curious resemblance to the Menes headcloth that was worn by ancient Egyptian pharaohs. It has the concentric ovals around the central axis. It has the representation of the pressure distribution in the rotating flow that lines up with the ovals, just like the modern diagram. It shows the velocity distribution in the vortex core versus the shear zone, the straight versus the curved line. The beard and the flaring folds of the headcloth trace out more or less the hyperbolic shape of the idealized vortex. But experts on Egypt have absolutely no idea what the origin of this very complicated and distinctive headcloth was. Another important diagram, if you want to understand the behavior of vortices, is this stream function diagram. If you want to follow or predict the path of any particular particle in the vortex, the concept of stream function is important. The trumpet structure in the middle is what is known as the stream function. It's an imaginary trumpet-shaped surface that a circling fluid particle would trace out. It's the same shape as the inside of the whirlpool, but upside down. The boat-shaped thing is a matching set of lines always at 90 degrees to the stream function, and it shows the velocity potential of particles at any point on the trumpet shapes. A symbol showing a subset of this information is found in ancient Egypt. Another very important symbol, the sacred boat. This is from a late period papyrus, so it's a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. The hull of the boat matches closely. The oars and paddles coincide with the center line of potential. The pedestal is definitely the right shape for stream function lines. You can see that it matches exactly even though it's inside the other lines. This sacred boat is a water vehicle, but it's often held aloft by the god of air. Air and water are both fluids. It's also a headrest and the mountain peaks between which the sun sets. So it has some relationship to the sun too, which is interesting. And just to show that this isn't just in ancient Egypt. We're talking about vortices. Now here's a cross-section of a vortex in the process of being created. It's a smoke ring. And so it makes this tree shape just as it's being created when the puff of wind comes out. It's the same thing that's behind the structure of a mushroom cloud. It essentially is a mushroom cloud on a very small scale. This is a Greek column. They bear a curious resemblance. So going back to Egypt, my point is that the ancient science in Egypt is heavily conflated with everyday things like people and animals. So let's now look at Hathor. What is the origin of Hathor? Why does she look like this? Where do the various meanings of her name come from? She's the goddess of fertility. She has cow ears, a very distinctive hairdo, a triangular face, and she's often shown in a frontal view, which is a little different than most Egyptian gods, which are shown in profile. She had a headdress consisting of cow horns with a sun disk in between, although they don't really look like any real cow horns. You can see it in red in the top center. She's known by many epithets or nicknames, such as the Mansion of Horus, or House of Horus, or the Great Menat. Now, Horus was originally the sun. The Eye of Ra and the Eye of Horus are the same thing for that reason. They were originally identical. The horns enclosing the sun disk, therefore, are enclosing or housing Horus, the sun. She was also called the Great Menat. What is the Menat? Well, the Menat was a heavy necklace made of bundled ropes tied together and balanced by a counterweight. And this is what the main picture in red in the center is. This is a Menat necklace. Now, Hathor is not a necklace, so why is she called the Great Heavy Necklace? Well, it could be because if you flip over the Menat necklace, it looks a lot like Hathor's traditional hairdo, including the overall shape, the parallel bands, and the cross bands. Why would her hairdo be so important? Well, the answer could come from the same field as the explanation behind the semisymbol. Notice Hathor's hair is bundled around her head in parallel strands, and the bundle gets a little wider at the bottom. Compare that to this. It's very much like this photograph from a wind tunnel experiment of flow around a rotating cylinder. In this photo, the air approaches from the bottom left, is deflected by the cylinder rotating clockwise, and leaves toward the bottom right. The region of flow that is closest to being parallel, like Hathor's hair, wraps around the cylinder and spreads out beneath it, just like Hathor's hair does. If you focus on the fluid that travels closest to the cylinder, it actually traces out a triangular path, traveling from the lower left to a region a little less than a diameter below the cylinder, then traveling around the cylinder and arriving back at roughly the same point before continuing off to the lower right. This is called the stagnation point, and this triangular fluid path around the cylinder corresponds to Hathor's curiously broad and triangular face. What the photo lacks is just the bundling ribbons that appear on both Hathor's hairdo and the Menat necklace, and may have been the inspiration for her cow ears, which occupy a similar position. If this were a diagram of the flow rather than a photograph, there might have been lines denoting parallel, or the term is equipotential flow, that would be denoted by lines similar to the ribbons. But a comparison to a photograph is a better example, tying the mythology back to the fundamental principle of nature rather than to an abstract concept or even an editorial decision. So this can explain the Menat necklace and Hathor's depiction as a woman with a broad triangular face and a particular hairstyle. So how does it explain the cow horns? How does it explain the sun disk? This is a rotating cylinder, it's not the sun. Well, the answer could come from this. Here's her cow horn crown with the sun disk superimposed on the photograph from the wind tunnel experiment. As you can see, if you turn it upside down, as we did with the Menat, and superimpose the sun disk on the rotating cylinder, the unrealistic cow horns trace out exactly the shape of a streamline around the rotating cylinder. It's important to note that this effect is the same whether it's a solid cylinder or the rotating core of a vortex, which rotates as a solid body. From the outside, they're indistinguishable. But to do the physical experiment, it's a lot easier to use a rotating cylinder on an axle. If this was the origin of these three important attributes of Hathor, it means that the Egyptian sun was not the sun. It was something else that they interpreted as being the sun, just as they interpreted a pry bar as a magical staff of power, and the concept of vortex stream function as a sacred design for a boat. In this case, they took the concept of the interaction between a fluid flow and the rotating core of a vortex and transformed it into the mansion of the sun. Now, if this is true, then the other symbology of the sun should match the reality of vortices. So let's explore the Egyptian sun. While other cultures have simple tales about how, for instance, the skunk got its stripes, or how the Milky Way came to be, or where thunder and lightning come from, the ancient Egyptian sun stands alone as the most absurdly complicated and nonsensical of any explanatory myth. It wasn't even particularly unchanging, with various reinterpretations of existing gods and symbols taking hold as fads in various time periods. Originally, the sky was ruled by the falcon Horus, and then by the midday sun, Re, and then the wind god and Re were conflated into Amun-Re, or with he who creates by sneezing in the form of Atum-Re, or with Horus to form Re-Hekathi. There are, however, certain features of the Egyptian sun that were fairly constant over time. The morning sun was represented by a dung beetle, Khepri, which means to roll, to come into being. The sun was believed to bring itself into being in the same way that a dung beetle rolls up dung to make a ball. During midday, the sun assumes the form of a solar disk and rolls across the sky. The evening sun is represented as a tired old man, but it could also be represented as a ram-headed god, for instance, Khnum. Just before setting, the sun was believed to create and throw off other gods, and so the ram-headed divine potter Khnum can represent the sun creating gods on his potter's wheel. The sun then sets between twin mountain peaks, the Akhet symbol, which is also duplicated by two lions back-to-back, Aker and Rudi, the lions of yesterday and tomorrow. The sun then travels in a solar boat into the underworld, with Set, the god of strength, wind, and storms, propelling the boat and fighting off Apep, the serpent of chaos, who seeks to destroy the sun. In some versions, the sun then visits Osiris, lord of the underworld, before being reborn in the morning and rolling into being again as Khepri. During the evening, the sun was thought to travel in an underground channel from west to east so that it could rise again each morning. In any particular time period, there may have been slightly different events or slightly different names attached to these events, but overall these are the elements that were most persistent and must have been based on something very important since they lasted thousands of years. The most bizarre phase of the journey of the sun, from the modern perspective, is probably the dung beetle phase. And any alternative explanation of the Egyptian sun needs to explain the origin of this conception. This has always been dismissed as just another superstitious bit of abstract weirdness on the part of ancient Egyptians, and it's never been explained. But a good explanation comes actually from fluid flow, and provides an answer as to the true identity of the Egyptian sun, and how it relates to the previous explanation of the origin of the symbolism of Hathor. The explanation also links together the various depictions of the sun and explains it in terms of misunderstood natural principles. So, how can something roll into being? Of all the things known to man and science, how many of them actually do roll into being? That analogy, according to the most expert interpretations of what Egyptians believed, is that the sun roll into something useful from something useless, like a beetle rolling useless dung into a useful ball of dung. Though we can't necessarily prove that the Egyptians did not believe the sun was literally made of dung, we will assume that they had at least the concept of the sun rolling into being from something other than dung, since it is, first of all, obvious, but also that they never mentioned any creature that could have made dung radiant and beautiful enough to be rolled into a ball to form the sun. If the sun wasn't made of dung, what was it made from? So, what important and useful thing rolls up from something useless? Maybe a tumbling snowball or a cinnamon bun? These are examples of things created from a mass of material merely by the process of rolling up, creating a new organizing structure in the simplest possible way. These are structures made by rolling up solid materials which already have an organizing structure, but even simpler things can be made by rolling up materials without any structure at all. Consider what a tornado is made of. We think of the tornado as a thing, but it's made of nothing but air. Nothing but air moving in a particular way. Similarly, a mushroom cloud following an atomic blast is merely a self-organizing structure made of moving air currents powered by the rising plume in the center. They're both examples of a vortex, which is merely a self-organized region of rotating fluid that rolls into being, just like the Egyptian sun. The gods Atum and Amun were incorporated into the solar deity with Re at various times and were supposed to have creation powers by sneezing and by breath, respectively. A sudden and short pulse of fluid, such as a sneeze or sharp puff of breath, naturally creates a vortex ring in the manner shown at the upper right. This is a cross-sectional diagram, the creation of a vortex ring from a puff of fluid. The moving fluid shoots out of an orifice, shown as the dotted lines, and it doesn't move straight, but it spreads out to the sides. The front of the jet flattens and begins to roll up like the horns of the ram, and then forms a donut-shaped cinnamon roll, forming the vortex ring that eventually breaks free and travels on its own. The mushroom cloud rising above an atomic explosion is exactly the same phenomenon on a larger scale. Vortex rings carry along the original fluid inside the ring-shaped vortex core and can travel quite a distance, which is why it's important to muffle your coughs and sneezes. The vortex ring can transport viruses, bacteria, and stinky coffee breath clear across a room. As the vortex ring travels, it continuously rolls outward as viewed from the front, and continues until its kinetic energy is lost to the surrounding fluid through viscous drag. As the vortex ring dies, it loses its round shape and kinks up into regular polygons like squares, triangles, and star shapes. Most vortex rings are invisible, and so we aren't really aware of them, but every tap on an empty plastic bottle, every pulse of a lawnmower or a car exhaust, and every gunshot produces a vortex ring. In terms of providing an overarching theme for the weird Egyptian sun, the vortex, and in particular the vortex ring, can explain quite a bit. It can be produced by a breath or a sneeze. It rolls into being like the ball of dung. It travels freely across the sky like the rolling sun disk of Ra, and, at least during the process of formation, does in cross-section resemble a ram's head. As the vortex ring decays away, it does slow down and become wobbly like an old man, and eventually disintegrates commonly into a star-shaped series of twists and then into pure turbulence. So this can explain the going forth by day, but what about the mythical twin mountain peaks? The answer to this comes from the flow not within the vortex, but around the outside of it. At the bottom left are two photographs from two different angles of the same vortex ring, a front view moving toward you and a side view moving to the right. If you could see the ring in motion in the front view, the smoke would be rolling from the inside out continuously around the ring-shaped tubular core. If you could see the side view in motion, the smoke ring would be rotating clockwise around the bottom circle and counterclockwise around the top circle. The circles are really just the smoky wall of the vortex core in profile. The fluid flowing around the bottom circle would look like the diagram shown on the right, depicting the somewhat V-shaped vortex core, a loop extending off the chart that would connect to a similar line for the other side of the vortex, and a series of streamlines showing how the surrounding air flows around the vortex core as the vortex ring travels forward. The diagram at the upper left shows the same thing but inverted, and showing how the shape of the flow around the vortex changes if it's a thin core or a fat vortex core. It's exactly the same flow pattern as the experiment matching Hathor's hair, and the necklace, and the crown of cow horns. The experiment in the photograph that was overlaid with Hathor's horns would be intermediate between the two cases shown here. The Egyptian sun is supposed to set between two mountain peaks, a symbol known as Akhet, and is also symbolized by Aker and Rudi, the lions of yesterday and tomorrow, who are back to back. Well, first of all, Aker and Rudi are shown with spots, so they can't be lions. They must be leopards, but they have manes, so they can't be leopards. But the Akhet symbol has spots, so it's clear that they inherited their spots from the Akhet symbol and not from a real feline. The diagram at the upper right showing the various streamlines around the outside of the vortex core bears a strong resemblance to the Akhet symbol, and oddly also has spots on it just like the Akhet. In the case of the modern diagram, the spots are because the diagram required a lot of complex calculations which coincided with regularly spaced points, denoted by the circles, and the dots were connected by drawing curves rather than calculating every point in between. It is very common for the sun disk in the Akhet symbol to be drawn with exactly the slight V shape as the vortex core in this modern diagram. Since the diagram is showing the motion of the vortex core through the surrounding air, one side of the diagram represents where the vortex core is going, and the other side represents where it has been. Hence the identity of one lion as the lion of yesterday, where the sun has been, and the other lion as the lion of tomorrow, where the sun will be. It's an apt description. The ancient Egyptians considered the motion of the sun to be toward, between, and behind the mountains, or lines as it set, whereas the vortex stays between the mountains continuously, and they move together sideways in the modern diagram. The difference is just the direction of motion. If you superimpose the two photos of the vortex rings and include the diagram of the streamlines around the vortex core, you end up with something looking like this. Now this overlay makes it easier to see that the small circles in the photograph of the side view are really the vortex core in cross-section, and that the oval outlines in between are actually the outlines of the vortex core, viewed almost but not perfectly from the side. A vortex visualized with the use of smoke and photography appears like a hollow tubular structure rather than a solid mass, for much the same reason that the sun is dimmer at sunrise and sunset than it is at noon. It's the amount of atmosphere through which the light passes that affects the intensity of the light. And when the sun is shining almost tangentially to the surface of the earth, its light's passing through many hundreds of miles of atmosphere, whereas at noon it's passing through only about 50 miles of atmosphere. Similarly, in areas where the vortex atmosphere is viewed on edge, it appears darker, whereas in areas where it's viewed straight on, it appears almost transparent. The reason I've shaded the streamline diagram is because the Egyptians tended to show it as being yellow, even though when the sun sets behind mountains, the mountains are always dark and bluish. Now let's compare this composite of some of the first diagrams on a book about vortex rings to some late period Egyptian sun symbolism from the papyrus of Nastana Batawi, usually entitled Sunrise at Creation. The two sun disks connected by an elliptical web of dotted lines closely matches the side view photograph of the vortex ring with its characteristic heavy outline around the vortex core where the smoke is thickest. The large circular area corresponds to the front view of the vortex ring, with the two goddesses pouring out libations in the form of primordial waters around the periphery. The pouring of primordial waters is a pretty obvious representation of a fluid dynamic phenomenon at work. The figures in a circle inside the circular enclosure are actually the Egyptian symbol meaning hoeing or turning the soil. These figures are turning the soil in just the same way that fluid would be turning over in a vortex ring, continually rolling forward and outward. At the top is the Akhet symbol of the sun setting between two mountain peaks. And from the previous slide, we recognize that this looks very much like a plot of the streamlines around the vortex core, including the spots. The twin mountain peaks oddly stand alone and are not part of a mountain range. The horizon forms their base, and the outside edges are basically cliffs, unlike any natural mountains, and certainly any mountains found in Egypt. The plot of vortex streamlines has a very similar shape because it is a textbook plot, and it's cropped into a rectangular area. The implication is that this symbol began as a published textbook plot, where editorial decisions were at work, the same as those made today. Now, how does this tie into the ancient descriptions of technology, such as ancient aircraft? Well, what is the science behind aircraft? What is the science of flight? It is aerodynamics. Aerodynamics is a subset of fluid dynamics. This is the science of flight.